everybody. Welcome to Holy Foley. This is Dr. Vanessa Theme Ament. And my guest today is Academy Award winner, multiple Academy Award winner, 7 Academy Award winning, sound designer Gary Rydstrom. 7, count them 7. Gary has worked on many wonderful films, and I can't list them all because I will fall asleep and lose my voice. But some of them are Saving Private Ryan, Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, The Fablemans, which I loved, Lincoln, which I loved, Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, which I loved, and what I'm really interested in talking to him about today, the latest West Side Story. So I've known Gary for quite a while, and he's one of my favorite people in the world. So welcome, Gary. I'm so glad to talk to you today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. You have the best named Foley podcast ever.
Yeah, well, this is Holy Foley, WHOLE-Y, not to be confused with the musical that I'm writing, which is Holy, HOLY, Foley. So wordplay, me and wordplay, it'll never stop. So before we start talking about what I want to focus on today a lot, which is going to be West Side Story Take 2, I want to hear, want everyone to know a little bit about you coming from the north shore of Chicago. You're up in the north area of Chicago, and you come out to USC. And if I recall, you had plans on being a professor, isn't that right? You wanted to teach.
I wanted to teach. Teaching was definitely a possibility. I also went to film school, and I thought for sure I'd be a pitch editor. That's what I thought I'd be. So sound was unexpected for me. But the thing about being that age and being in school is that you got to keep your options open. You don't know what's going to come your way.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, it doesn't surprise me that you'd want to be a picture editor, because having worked with you in several different ways now, and having talked with you in lots of different instances, in different approaches, your eye for detail and your love of history and the cultural aspects of film. I don't think a lot of people know this about you, because you're not just a sound guy. And one of the reasons I really enjoy talking with you is because you have a deep knowledge of the history. You look for detail. You really enjoy going back and looking into the ins and outs of the culture and the people that work on the films. So you got plucked out and you started working with George Lucas, and the rest, as we say, is history, because you've just sailed off and flown like crazy and done all sorts of amazing things, not only as a sound designer and a supervising sound editor, but also as a mixer. And then you've consulted, and you're like one of the grand poobahs. And one of my favorite.
And don't forget, I also did Foley performing at least twice, Vanessa. Twice. I was a Foley artist twice. There you go.
Okay, so you have to tell everybody what those 2 instances were.
I worked on a film to set it up. When I went to Lucasfilm in 1983, it was a small enough place that you could get opportunities to try to do everything. So I did Foley for a film called Remo Williams.
Oh, yes.
Which people remember.
I do.
And then I did Foley for Willow. There you go. So
did you work with Denny and do Foley on it?
Well, Denny Thorpe was, the Foley person. I had recorded a lot of Denny's Foley work, and so I knew her well. She was pregnant. So in Willow, if people remember, was kind of a lot of big characters with armor and weapons and running around. And so I did that with Denny on the stage, but she was pregnant, sitting in a chair with a notebook. And then I was the guy, sweating a lot, running around with heavy things on my shoulder. So I was a great experience. I loved that I did Foley for Willow.
Now, see, I was up in the Bay Area at that time, and I was doing some Foley over across the Bay at Salzance Fantasy. And here's the little connection, the 6 degrees, it's only 1 degree. Denny took maternity leave, and for 2 years, I was over there with you, doing some stuff over with you guys over at Skywalker. And so so there I was over at the Graduate Theological Union doing my master's in divinity. So now I'm divine. And then
well, holy Foley makes sense.
Right, I know. Over on Holy Hill giving holy hell. But what's funny is I was over there at Skywalk with you guys, and then going over back to Salzance Fantasy, and then being in Berkeley, and then flying down to LA and doing stuff with like Steve Flick for Weddington. And it was a great time because, and I loved working all those three different places because the workflow was very different. The people were very different. The cultures were very different. And I got there just as Denny had her baby and went for a couple of years off on maternity leave. And it was a great opportunity for me because I got to work there. And Dave Stone, who I was with at the time, worked on Willow with you. So, and Terry Ecton and the whole group. So yeah, I remember that. But I didn't know that you had actually done Foley on Willow.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, I went on to do, it's a learning experience. Everyone who wants to be a sound designer, which is,
Yeah,
crazy term, I think you should do Foley. You should record Foley and do Foley because it forces you to kind of be clever in the moment, and
yeah.
and come up with ingenious ways to think about and make sound. And it's kind of like the directors have become really great feature directors because they did TV. They had to go really fast. So Foley, you have, you can plan ahead, you can do all that kind of stuff. But you looking at a film, you got a few weeks, and you've got to generate sounds quickly and efficiently and in sync. So it's pretty good training.
And you find out that it's not what you expect it is because things, you don't use the things that they are. You think about the sound elements and what you want it to sound like and what the story world is and how it does it fit into the narrative and what are sound effects going to be editing in and what is already in production and what are the dialogue editors saving from production. So there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, and it it's invaluable to think about. And when I recorded Foley, I remember recording Danny and others, and I would never look at what they were using to make. I probably should, because I would have learned how did you make that sound, because I didn't want to see what they were doing, because I have, when I give lectures in sound, I have my golden rule. My golden rule of sound for film is that it doesn't matter what a sound is, it only matters how it makes you feel.
Right.
So when
Oh,
you do Foley, you're trying to get the sound. In many ways, when I'm not performing it, I don't want to see the props they're using because I want to hear the sound separate. It's this weird thing in sound, film sound, where you separate the sound from the thing that made it. You
mhm.
think about it just as the sound in its own world and see how it could work in the film. It's this weird, you make it in this crazy way that you guys talk about, which is what makes it fun to talk about Foley. How the hell did you do that? And then you get the sound, it has some emotional effect, and you put it in the movie and it has a third life. But that, I was trying to think ahead of this about all the props and tricks for creating sounds for Foley. I don't know that many. You know more than I do, and I think I don't know that many because I don't want to know. I like to think about the sound
Yeah.
separate from the trick, if you call it a trick, or the production of the sound. So the sound to me is this ethereal thing that lives in its own universe. I try to think that way.
So I think Foley artists all approach it a little bit differently. And I always say this every time I talk to anybody, depending on what we did before and what our approach is and how we go through the world, because I'm primarily an auditory and kinesthetic person, not a visual person. So for me, I always think in terms of pitches as a musician and as an actor.
Mhm.
I think about the character or the story. And then as a dancer, I'm kinesthetic. And so I'm thinking in terms of also, is it likely to be music in this scene? And then primarily story and the characters. So I never pre-plan what it's going to be. But I have to tell you, there are a lot of Foley artists that really always think they know how they're going to do something before they do it. And that's very different than me. I really don't. I have to be in the scene and kind of be there and get a sense of it. And it's very zen for me. And I think there are two reasons for that. First off, in music, um, when I sing a song, I am in the emotional moment of it because my voice is trained enough where I already know how to place it and where my voice is going to go. So I get into the emotion of it or the style of it or the story of it, depending on whether it's musical theater, classical, or jazz. And then I'm trusting myself to take it where it needs to go. So I'm going to allow myself the right brain freedom of being in the moment and listening to the lyric, because the lyric is the most important thing to me. And the second piece is that I don't want to predetermine, because then it's going to feel artificial. So one of the reasons my footsteps, I think, might have been more natural sounding is because I just let the person on screen sort of be the person guiding me. And I didn't want to be the one determining what the person on screen was going to do. I let that person on screen determine what I needed to do. But I think we're all very different. And I've worked with enough Foley artists to know that we all have such different personalities and such different approaches and such different kinds of egos that I just assume we all do it very, very differently. I just know for me, I don't like to predetermine too much because I don't want it to be artificial. I like to be as natural as possible and then add if it needs more. So that's just my approach. But that's kind of my approach to everything. So I would like to get into a general approach of how, and you and I have discussed this before, parenthetically over beer, close parentheses, but I would like everyone to hear kind of your philosophy of how you might, when you first get an assignment or project, a gig, and you're looking, you're doing a spotting session with a director, or you're looking at the film, or you're reading the script, or however your first exposure to a film is, how you're thinking about what your approach to the sound design, if that's going to be your role, how you approach it. I'd like to hear your theory or your methodology.
Well, what you were saying about your approach to Foley is similar to what I start a film by letting the film kind of tell me something. That's even, we have spotting, with some of the great directors I've sat and we've talked about the film. I find the films themselves kind of tell me, they inspire me in some way. I think the first step is to kind of embrace the film and try to get it, as much as possible. And then let it generate ideas about what kind of sounds. The first thing for me is often, what do I go and collect? What do I go and record? And it's amazing. The world of sound is so big that every film's got a kind of a feel to it. And so sounds have different feel. So a gritty science fiction film versus a fantastical science fiction film, different kind of sounds. So the first step is to collect sounds that feel right for the movie. So I find so much of this is highfalutin, but I find so much of film work is based on emotion. Kind of your emotional reaction to, and sound is such an emotional thing. Every sound that we create, music itself, all that stuff, it's got an emotional component to it. So I try to keep an open mind about what those things are. So the first thing is to really embrace the film and say, okay, what do you need? What can I do for you, film? And start collecting stuff and make, if you're in charge of a sound crew, then your job is to kind of assemble both a crew that has the talents that are appropriate for the film, and then to kind of come up with some sort of guiding principle for, the feeling that you're going to generate from Foley to ambiances, the sound effects.
When you were doing Saving Private Ryan, which I thought was just absolutely spectacular, how did you decide? The opening scene is the one everybody remembers, but then you get into it and you're really getting into the story of this family and this young man that you're looking for and trying to keep from dying because he's the only son left. How did you decide? And I'm sure you and Spielberg talked about it because he's very involved with what he wants. And then I think Michael Kahn edited that, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because he was his go-to. How did you decide what the opening scene, the landing, with that really subjective, bombastic sense where we all felt completely exhausted from it, and then going into the story? How did you decide how that sound transition would be? Because it's really an assault. and you feel
Mhm.
completely exhausted and overwhelmed. And then you have to get into the story of what this is really all about. How did you make those decisions?
Well, Spielberg's really good at one of the guiding principles he gave us for the sound of that was he didn't want it to sound Hollywood, and I knew what he meant. You know, Hollywood for war movies, like a lot of movies, we tend to exaggerate, kind of make it bigger than life. In the case of Normandy Beach D-Day invasion, you know, you can't get any bigger than life anyway. So our job was to stay true to the sounds of that experience as much as possible, even though we had it created from scratch from little tidbits that get edited into a chaotic war. It had to feel, well, realistic. It had to feel true to the memories. One of the first things I did there is I found, luckily, there were still vets, people who of the military of that era, and even of the European war, and they would tell me their memories of sounds. You know, what kind of memories did you have? And the opening scene is, if you think about it, it's not a scene about guns, it's a scene about bullets,
Mhm.
because the guns are far away. So you hardly even hear the guns. You really hear bullet impacts and
Yeah.
artillery coming in and explosions. The guns are background. And so it's got a point of view. And then, like all things, I derive kind of our approach to sound from how the film is shot. And Spielberg shot that opening scene, I think, brilliantly, because it wasn't literally point of view camera, but you felt like you were the height of a human being going through this experience. And so what sound could do was do all the crazy stuff around you and give you that experience. And the film was not doing wide shots and long shots and establishing shots. It was doing human level stuff, right?
Mhm.
So in one of my other theories, since I try to keep up with Walter Murch with my theories. My other theory is that sound and picture are best when they tell the same story from two different angles. So that opening scene, you might think of it as this grand, amazing battle scene like you've never seen before. But if you really watch it without the sound, it's very intimate. It's just the camera seeing only a few people at a time. And sound is telling you all the stuff that's going on around you and how horrible that is. So what made that opening scene good for sound was the way Spielberg shot it. And it gave us the opportunity to use sound in a way that was telling the same story from its own angle.
I would agree with you that it was not like I would remember Battle of the Bulge when I was a kid, seeing Battle of the Bulge, where it felt very big. And that wasn't even a particularly really Hollywoody kind of sound movie, but it seems very general. Whereas the opening of
Mhm.
Saving Private Ryan is very personal and you're getting caught up in the characters already. It feels very subjective. And I think that's why it still captivates and you still feel it. And you're talking about emotion, Gary. Um, I don't think a lot of people think about sound in emotion. They think of music as emotion, but I agree with you
Mhm.
that sound is very emotive. And I remember one of the chapters I wrote that's in a book, and it's about Sounds Like Action is the name of the book. And I wrote about John McTiernan films, and I talked about sound as music in films.
Mhm.
And I talked about Predator and Die Hard and The Hunt for Red October. And I talked about the musicality of sound. And I feel like there is such an emotive factor in the way that sound can make you feel. And I think that this is overlooked a lot, which is why I think so many people underestimate the importance of it, because it's sonic. Music is sonic, and sound effects, Foley, anything you hear is sonic, and we hear before we see because we're in the wound. So I
Yep.
agree with you that the sound potential, the emotion potential of using sound effectively, and I think of the movie The Pianist, which does it brilliantly. Um,
Yep.
when he's being bombarded and he has that subjective sound experience when it's all around him, and we are experiencing what he is hearing and losing his hearing and getting the ringing in his ears, and he's a musician and it's affecting the way he's experiencing things, not as they're happening, but as he's hearing inside his head. I think that's why that opening scene is so powerful. And then you have to make that transition where we get back into now what the mission of the story is. But we have now
Mhm.
been introduced to the characters through this joined experience of landing in Normandy. And I think that through the years, Spielberg has become a better and better and better storyteller. He was always good, starting with his TV movie. I think,
Oh yeah, his TV work, and tell you just
yeah,
I just did a
that was a really
update
good
of the mix
episode.
for sure. I just did an update because it's the 50th anniversary of Sugarland Express.
Yes,
So I got to sort of re-experience Sugarland Express, and then all that stuff is still there in that movie, which
yeah,
people sometimes forget about. But yeah, my God, I mean, I'm lucky, as I say. I mean, he's a good filmmaker, and that helps the sound crew because the filmmaking is so brilliant. And what you say, it's an important point that I try to make all the time. If music works, we all agree music works, right? Oh my God, music makes us feel something, and it's
yeah,
an emotional experience.
yeah,
If music works, all sound works the same.
right.
I mean, there's no, a door creak and a cricket chirp can have the same, have an emotional resonance too. And that's our job when you're creating stuff on a Foley stage or cutting sound effects for a movie or choosing an ambience, or you're the music editor or the music supervisor or the composer. You're always thinking about how it makes an audience feel. Um, I think film is a more emotional medium than an intellectual medium. I think we can talk about it intellectually, but I think it comes down to gut reaction. And I have no idea. I can't analyze. I have no idea what makes a sound have a certain resonance or music. I have no idea. I can't explain neurologically how anything works. All you can do is react to something yourself and then make note of that and say,
Yeah,
well, it works for me. I hope it works for everybody else because this is, I have no, it's intellectually, um, I can't break it down. I can't go into a movie and say, if I found something with this kind of frequency range and this rhythm, that would have such an emotional effect. I don't know. You just kind of have to,
yeah,
that's why you wouldn't say your approach to Foley by doing it in the moment or with the film there. You can't, in some ways you can't plan ahead for that reaction. When you get the right reaction, you're done.
I agree. So taking this thought and getting into your work on West Side Story, which I just loved the film. And I was open-minded to it because you and I had discussed it before because we'd been working together on the TCM um, project and you being at Ball State when I was there, which was great. We did the Mad About Musicals project together, which was just so much fun. The
Yeah.
lectures and everything. It was just one of the best times. But also, I love the musical and musicals are really my thing. And we went and saw it. And I kept an open mind because I don't like to get stuck in old versions of things. I like to be open to new interpretations. And I loved it. I loved
Oh,
it
good. Oh,
even
good.
more than
Okay.
I thought I would. And there are several things that I noticed that I thought were particularly fascinating as far as story, but I also want to talk about your choices for sound. And I am assuming that you went back and saw the original and then made some mental notes and thought about what would be happening with Spielberg's reinvention of it. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. And then I'm going to spice up some of the discussion with some things that I noticed. But I'd like to start with you first, because I thought it
Yeah.
was
Well, I first of all,
fascinating
I can't
to
wait.
reinvent a classic.
Yeah, no, bold of Spielberg to do West Side Story, which is, one of the most admired, beloved, um, awarded musicals or films of all time. I mean, it's an amazing. But what it is before the film musical, the first film version, it was a Broadway. It had its own. It's a beautiful piece of work. I mean, West Side Story as the book, the music, the story, the characters. It's a beautiful piece of work. So, um, and if you think about it, Spielberg had never done a musical before.
Mhm.
um he can do anything, but and I had never mixed a musical before, if you don't count Captain EO, which I did for Disneyland, which is kind of a musical, but we can talk about that in another podcast. So I took it as a learning experience to figure out, okay, what do we do with musicals? um And and to me, what was important was the music kind of drove everything to the point where sound effects and Foley, which we'll talk about, all sorts of ways that we made all that stuff sit in the rhythm and the pitch and the feel of the music.
Mhm.
So it didn't feel added on. In the first version of the movie, of the time, it was more the case. You don't really hear Foley, you don't hear movement. It's even ambiances, the sense of New York is less in the first movie than in the Spielberg version. It's very important in the Spielberg version. Um, there's a grittiness or naturalism to it. You believe that these characters are, you know how it is with musicals. There's that moment where I don't believe it. No one sings in real life.
Right.
And West Side Story pulled it off. The tone of it, the direction of it is that realistic, grounded, in a real place, and people are really singing in real locations and dancing in the streets for America, or arguing over a boy like that. It feels real, but it's still they're singing. How do you pull that off? Um, and so there are a couple things that we did that were different from the first movie that were good for sound. One is that the Spielberg version is set in the kind of the urban renewal idea of this neighborhood getting torn down, what becomes the Lincoln Center in that neighborhood. And so you have these characters, these rival gangs that are in a world that's being destroyed, taken away from them. And it's, so in the background in the soundtrack, you hear destruction and construction and trucks, and it's all kind of going away. So there's the realism of the background is very specific to their story because their world is going away and they have to fight over what's left. um, and then but then finding ways with everything, the dialogue, the singing, the ambiances, the Foley, so that you believe every moment is really happening on screen. It doesn't have that Hollywood feel of the artificiality of you're watching a filmed play, or you're watching something artificial. It feels, oh my God, these people are really there. And when it works, then the acting and the emotions work really well for me because it's real. And so I knew that my job was in sound was to create the sense of New York in that era and how it was disappearing, put everything grounded in reality so that these people are really singing and moving and dancing even in a real place. And when you believed it, I felt like you felt it more.
Mhm. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was changing the location of a lot of where the numbers took place from what the original did. Not just changing
Mm-hmm.
who was singing things, like Pops is now Rita Moreno. It's not Pops anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then she sings there's a place for us, which is a very different take on who is singing this. And
Right.
I think that was a controversial choice. I felt that it worked very well. But this is where we get into taking today's view and then putting it in time backwards and having somebody look at something from then. And that's kind of interesting too, because I think a lot of people get fixed in the idea of it being the way it was then, with Pops
Mm-hmm.
being male and Tony and Maria singing There's a Place for Us. But I was very open to the idea of her singing it because she's got a whole different take on what that song means.
Yeah. And she's Rita Moreno. It's ingenious to find a role for her to play. It was they were changing up the original story, Tony Kushner, but giving Rita Moreno a song that important of a song, that emotional song at that moment, is great. Partly because it's her and the history that she brings to it. But
Well,
yeah,
that's a
and that's
star-studded
also one
thing
of the
too. That's a
and that's one of the
star-studded
live
thing.
recordings too.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. It's direct sound.
Yeah, they did, in a couple of cases they did recording on the set, and that's really her singing as she sang on the set. So talk about acting. I mean, that's the other thing in musicals that I learned. It comes across really well if it's a live recording, and there's a couple of Boy Like That, I Have a Love, that argument between Anita Maria was live, and you feel the acting. But what the achievement of that film to me was a lot of the scenes where the songs were pre-recorded, done the traditional way, still have that kind of immediacy, so that you feel the characters and you feel the acting. But I mean, that's the dynamic of musicals. That's tricky, because the reality of people singing kind of takes you a moment to, can I connect with this? But then so you want that combination of the stylization of singing with the reality of acting, and I thought Spielberg pulled it off really, really well.
Was there a lot of ADR for this film?
There was a fair amount of ADR, but not as much as we've done in past years. I mean, Todd Maitland was the production mixer, and he recorded so well, even on location. I mean, most of the ADR would be in song moments where the dialogue was hard to get,
Yeah.
or but not a lot of ADR. I mean, yeah, it had a reality to it, as much as a musical can have a reality. If you find that reality plus musical, it works really well. I learned a lot. And the other thing we talked about when we did our musical, talking about it, and when I was looking back at old musicals and thinking along with you about the history of musicals,
Right.
those moments you go in and out of songs.
Mhm.
I don't know, there must be a name for those moments, because they're so important in musicals. I don't know of one, but that when you sneak in, or you set up with some orchestration that starts to get you thinking in terms of musical
Mhm.
music, and then the singing starts, and then how you come in and how you come out of the songs is so key, and so you don't get thrown out of the movie. And I thought that, given that Spielberg had never done a musical before, he did those all really well.
One of the things that I noticed that I thought was really intriguing was when I watched the film, I was fascinated with the character of Anybody's, because deciding that Anybody's was trans in this
Mhm.
version,
Yeah,
immediately,
more overtly. Mhm.
okay, so we're on the same page. I'm extremely aware of the coding. So when I was watching this film, I was so aware that the whole idea of a tomboy was always coding for a lesbian. And
Mhm.
now New York Broadway has always been more progressive than Hollywood in the way that it would write characters. So I have no doubt that Anybody's was always supposed to be a lesbian wanting to hang with the guys. But it's coding in Hollywood, and it's not really very obvious, because they're trying to say, why don't you go be like the other girls? And so it's coded because Hollywood was never as obvious or as open, especially when we're coming out of the blacklisting era, which I want to get to in a minute. And as I was watching it, I thought, I think a lot of people don't realize all of the coding that went on in films in the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s, and leaving the 50s and going into the 60s because of the blacklist, for people who were in the know, to kind of give them another reading of a film that a lot of America would not have read. And, if you study Hitchcock, this is going on, but it was there in this film with Anybody's. And then Spielberg just turns her into a very clear trans character. And so that it's Anybody's, it's, a very different kind of character, and much more what we are used to looking at now in today's world, where we are allowing ourselves to be more open about gender fluid kinds of characters and non-binary, and we're grappling with this in our society. Now, what I was curious about, so I did my research. So when the original West Side Story was being conceived, I was aware of all of the gay men involved: Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, and Stephen Sondheim. And none of them out. And Jerome Robbins had testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. He had admitted to going to communist meetings and had avoided giving names for a long time. He finally gave 10 names. Jack Guilford was one of the names, and Jack Guilford and Zira Mostel never spoke to him again. And it was years before Leonard Bernstein would work with him again. And then he did on this film in 1961. And I thought, you know, because I worked with Maggie Field when I worked with Shirley Jones, and she assisted Jerome Robbins on the film West Side Story. She was our choreographer for the Shirley Jones show that I worked on when I was right out of high school. And she'd worked with Jerome Robbins. I knew he had been gay, and I did some research on him. And it was when he was threatened for being outed. He was threatened with being outed at a time when that would have destroyed his career. They were going to destroy his career that way or blacklist him, that he finally gave names.
Wow.
So he was probably forgiven by these people, by Bernstein and others, because it was like, you're going to be outed, and we all know what that would do to our careers. So that's probably why they finally, years later, decided to work with him again. And that is why he named names. It was because he would have been outed before it would have been acceptable. And so when I put all of that together, I'm so fascinated by the fact that there was a coded character by these gay men who were involved in this show, which is a very acceptable thing to do in New York. New York is always way ahead. Broadway is always way ahead of Hollywood in what, not so much now, but certainly even now it does much more cross race and all sorts of things with casting before Hollywood has been doing it. It had been doing it. And that was just something I thought was interesting, because when I did see this version, I went, well, they're making it more clear now who Anybody's was, that Anybody's was, a gay woman. And now they're just going all the way and making this a transgender person. So that was another choice that I thought was interesting that Spielberg decided to make. And I wonder if there was any discussion about any of this at all, or was it just there?
That was just there. I mean, a lot of that is, it's amazing to think that character, Anybody's, obviously it was there from the beginning. The intentions are there from the beginning, and a lot of what Spielberg did, which we didn't talk about and when I was with him, but his casting choices made things clearer, both ethnicity wise and for Anybody's, sort of making it more overtly not just a tomboy, but something more of a trans character. So is his choices about who he cast. I've heard him often say that he thinks the most important part of filmmaking is casting, and I think he did it really well in this movie in a lot of different ways. In some ways, his casting is one of the improvements, if you can use that word, on the first version, which was of its time. And Natalie Wood, I love Natalie Wood, but not exactly Puerto Rican, and it wasn't her singing. So there's it's nice to have ethnically more appropriate actors who are doing their own singing, and that was one of the benefits of this approach.
The other funny thing when you go back to the original one is Richard Beymer playing Tony, and then Larry Kurt playing it on Broadway, two gay men, and Richard Beymer is just so wrong in that movie because he's just so obviously not hetero, and of course they're going for box office, and they're not thinking of these things through, and there's such a political discussion about political correctness and who plays what. But it is very funny the way that people were thinking about things in the 60s about who is box office rather than appropriate casting. And I would say that the casting of this particular version was really remarkable. And it's just been a very exciting thing. Was there any kind of particular strange challenge that you ran into on this version that might have been problematic for you? I mean, like, for example, the mixing must have been a little tricky.
It, I don't probably, it was different for me. And I was really, the thing that I micromanaged on this movie was to try to make sure that everything that I was adding, sound effects, ambiances, Foley, worked with the music. Sometimes you have movies where, I often have to figure out how my part of a soundtrack meshes with music. And there are times in some movies where it can feel different. It can feel of a different, almost clashing with the music, if that's the spirit of the film. In this case, it's not, it's part of the music. And I have to say, Michael Kahn, you said, and was the editor, and Spielberg did a really good job of shooting scenes and cutting them so that the action of the scenes, not just the dancing, but the action in things like the rumble, or even Maria, the non-dancing songs, were still rhythmically, the action was rhythmically within the music. I don't know how they did it, if they had earbuds, if they could figure it out, but so when we added our part, climbing a fire escape, or, dancing in a gym, or walking in a gym, or a knife fight in a warehouse, it sat in the music so beautifully because it was designed that way. And one of the things we did then was make sure that the pitch of the sounds didn't clash with the music. We micromanaged one of the last steps she did. I had an editor go through with the finished music stem from the final mix and micro sync, footsteps and sound effects so that it came within beats, and so that it's like coming into focus. So all the sound really felt like, if you watch the first movie, you're not hearing a lot of those kind of sounds, not hearing a lot of footsteps and sound effectsy kind of moments. But we wanted to have the realism of that, but have it become musically appropriate. So that was something I was very proud of. It took a lot of work to make everything really sit together, and it was all about supporting the music, living within the music, and not clashing with it.
How did you select the Foley artist for this one? Because I think Margie O'Malley was one of them.
Well, Margie, like you, Margie is a dancer,
So
so
you
that's
selected
kind of
her
a
to do it because she was
no-brainer.
there.
Margie's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, Margie had a fun connection to Spielberg. I believe what she told me was she was one of the background dancers, and there's a great USO dance scene in 1941 that Spielberg directed.
Uh,
One of the moments in his previous movies that almost felt like a musical, but not quite. There's another one in Temple of Doom that anything goes. It feels almost like a musical. And she was one of the background dancers in 1941. So she's a dancer. She had that sense of rhythm and could really analyze what kind of moves the dancers were making and then try to
yeah.
emulate them. Kim Patrick, the other Foley artist, was an unusual Foley crew for me. Kim and Margie, but Kim has done a lot of sound effects work, sound design. So she thinks, like a sound designer. So she brought that to the Foley. So she was creative that way. And Margie, but also had a sense of dance and rhythm. And Margie was natural, but we knew that was going to be key to the Foley for this. A dance background was, and you couldn't not have that. So
Yeah.
Margie was perfect.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought because I knew her background.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems like going back and looking at the original and then taking it to the new one, these are all of the things that I noticed when I saw it. Is there anything else about this particular version that I am missing that you would want to add and make sure that I'm aware of?
Well, from a Foley, you might find interesting. I've talked about this when we did publicity for it when it first came out, but I was really proud because I didn't do it, but I'm proud that we did it. Todd Maitland, who recorded the sound on the set, had done a lot of other musicals, and he came up with this idea of once they finished a big dance scene, especially the interior or any dance scene, he talked Spielberg and the production amazingly into saying, okay, give me a pass. We recorded all, you shot it all, you've done it. Give me a pass. We don't shoot camera. We have the characters, the actors, the dancers do the same dance routine, whichever one it is, a continuous take. And then I set up mics on the location and we record them actually dancing. So we couldn't use any of that stuff on the exterior, so America on the street was all Foley, but some of the stuff in the gym, some of the interior stuff, some of the Officer Krupke scene, things like that, are a combination of Todd Maitland's recording of the actual actors moving with our Foley and finding that blend so you believe it all kind of comes together. That was part of it was Todd's brilliant idea. And who was Spielberg? It's amazing. He said, yeah, take the whatever it took, an hour on the production schedule to stop everything else so that we record something genuine for the track, But Spielberg knew going in there were a lot of things he wanted to make sure were right about this approach to a musical. It was his call to do everything right in terms of how the singing was mic'd, how the singing was mic'd in the pre-records, how the synchronization was achieved by the actors on the set. All the hard stuff in musicals when you have to perform all these details, including letting us record the dancing on the set. So that, like I said before, I think the key for him was that every moment in the movie feels real. You don't feel the sync is off, or it doesn't feel like, the actor, sound people know that transition I talked about, which is so important in musicals, from dialogue to singing. One of the giveaways is a sound giveaway where you have the production recording of the guy on the set, and then he starts singing, and it has a whole different quality, right? Yeah. So we went to extreme measures with the mic choice, mic placement, where that transition happened. Andy Nelson was the dialogue and music mixer with me.
And he's wonderful.
He did a brilliant job. So you do not sense that transition from dialogue to singing back to dialogue. It doesn't sound any different.
I have to say the Officer Krupke number, completely unexpected to do it in the police station. And I loved it. I loved it. That was so inventive. And it was so irreverent. It was so much more irreverent. And I just loved it because it was more irreverent being done that way.
I love the Krupke. One of the great things with Spielberg is that he does so much that one of the things that happens on mix stage, there are scenes that he wants to watch over and over again just for the fun of it, not to give notes. That was one of them. The other one was America. He wanted to watch the America scene where they sing America in the Streets. And we just sit and watch, no notes, just sit back and just, he made it, it's his film. We sit back for 20 minutes and enjoy. Now, Officer Krupke, you talk about tone. In that one, there are sound effects that are almost Warner Brothers cartoon. You got a hand on a head, or just little impacts and sounds that are a little on the cartoony side. Nothing else in the movie is like that. And again, the precision of the action, the way it was shot, the actors, the way they moved, the way they put a chair here, or push a chair there, or jump on the desk, or slide on a newspaper, was all planned out. And then we cut sound effects. Terry Eckton, who you mentioned earlier, was the sound effects editor on that scene. And our Foley people made sure that it synchronized. It had that, sound is about rhythm, not just music sounds, but wow. And that scene was a brilliant use of rhythm in sound effects and Foley. So they are part of the comedy of the scene, not just the quality of the sound, which some of them are a little on the over the top side, but they're so precise. That's what I was proud of in the end, that we did that. So I was no problem for me watching Officer Krupke over and over again because Steven wanted to watch it because it was so fun. I had thought it was fun too.
I think it's really interesting, just to kind of put a button in all of this. You learn more about how a director works, I think, when you talk to people who are in the, what we call the below the line kind of craft, at the final stages, where we're going into the dub, we're going into the sound effects and the picture editing, the sound effects and the music, and putting it all together in the dub. That's when the director is really letting his or her hair down and getting into the nuts and bolts and showing who they are, because there's no one around. And that's when we really know who they are. I feel like that's how I know who the directors that I've worked with really are. I get a lot more sense of Joe Dante and Tim Burton and several people that way. And you learn so much about their process and who they are when they're not in the beginning of it or doing what the public expects, but in that dark room of the dub stage, when it's just the very end and they're doing that final bit and putting it all together, and we're all on the same team, and it's in post.
I think you said it, I say this all, you said a really important thing, which is it's you get to know a lot about how filmmakers are. You're also there at the moment the movie finally becomes a movie.
Yeah.
And when you say magic, to me, all art forms, and what the moment you know you're done is when it becomes magic. Oh, it's magic now. Let's pull back. And the great thing about post, great thing about mixing, and people like Spielberg, I don't know if he means it or not, but he says it's his favorite. He probably tells all the people this, but he says it's his favorite part. And you think about it, it's when your movie, it's your movie, is finally a movie.
It's
Up
a
until
movie.
then, the magic, it's like looking at the backside of a magic trick. It's not fully magic until the mix is close to done or done. Until then, you're seeing the seams, and it's kind of, you're seeing the scaffolding, and you're seeing the bits and pieces, and it feels unfinished. When it snaps into a finished mix, which is now a finished movie, and it's a privilege and exciting to be there when the filmmaker sees their film as a film for the first time.
Yep.
And when you're on the set, which is what people think filmmaking is, on a set with a megaphone and actors, which is fun. But what you're doing there is you're creating the potential for magic, right? You're capturing little tidbits and moments, and those are important. And then you go through this laborious process to cut it and add sound and the score and everything else. And it doesn't always come together, but when it comes together, to be able to sit next to the person whose movie it is, and then, like I say, Spielberg would watch America. We just watch it. It's a long, wonderful dance sequence, and it's exuberant and wonderful. And he would sit and watch it and enjoy. You think, is it egotistical to enjoy your? No, he enjoys when
He's
he's
like
enjoying.
He's like a kid.
Think of all the people, the thousands of people it takes to get to that point where it looks good on the big screen, the sound is good, the music sounds full and rich, the Foley's in, the sound effects and everything's done, and it's a finished movie. It's like, wow. And I'm with you. I've got a post mentality. I like feeling. I'm all for all the other aspects of filmmaking, but I like the feeling of it's the pulling apart, the pulling down the curtain and saying, here's the movie. And when that moment happens, I'm glad to be there.
I am totally with you. This has been wonderful, Gary. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. It was fun to talk about it. And I'm happy I got to work on that movie in particular. I'm glad that we got to talk about it. And I'm glad you liked it, because you're an expert. So
I loved it.